And I'm so glad Lucy's here with us again. Lucy Amis-Rosario, among many, many talents, is one of our experts around trauma-informed practices and healing-centered organizations. And Lucy joins us from a new endeavor recently. I don't know if she'll say more, but very recently, of course, has worked in schools and has done a great deal of work for us here at Atlas. So thanks for coming back to share more with us today, Lucy.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be back here with Atlas and everybody who is on. Today, we are talking about healing-centered organizations. And so this is going to really look at organizational culture and particularly things we can do in leadership roles. And while there are formal leadership roles, I think with this information, even if you're not in a formal leadership role, there's a lot of different ways to be a leader and lead this work in organizations. But please feel free to jump in and ask questions at any time. So to get us started, those of you who have been with me before, this is going to look really familiar, but I just like to give everybody a moment to take a few deep breaths. It'll just be 30 seconds or so, but try to ground and get present on this webinar. I know there's a lot of distractions, but I think it's helpful to take a moment to try to refocus for the next hour and a half. All right, thank you. So this is just a little bit about me. As Patsy said, I've done a lot of work with Atlas. I'm a clinical social worker. I've had the opportunity to work here in the Twin Cities, as well as in Mexico and in New York City. And I've kind of jumped in between the worlds of nonprofit and K-12 education. Out in New York, I worked in a community-based organization where we did a lot of adult education with ESL and employment training. And then since coming here to Minneapolis, I've worked in nonprofits that focus on healing from family violence, as well as in K-12 school districts around the metro area, trying to help them build up their mental health supports. Recently this summer, I made another switch and I'm currently the Director of Evaluation and Training for Northeast Youth and Family Services. And that's a community mental health organization in the Northeast Metro. And so it's been kind of fun to get back into the nonprofit world. And a lot of my background has been heavily in trauma work, and we are doing some of that out in NYFS, and I might actually do some therapy again. It's been a little while, so I'm excited for that. You can see on my pictures that I am a proud mom of two kids. The oldest just started middle school, so I'm in an entirely new world parenthood-wise. And then I also have some fur babies. So I have Max, and then the cats are JJ and Roman. And so we have a bit of a wild house here. If you've been in trainings with me, you have probably seen this. I like my Prince check-in. I would love it if folks are up for unmuting and saying it. You can also put it in the chat. Who like how are you and what prints best represents how you're feeling today. And if there is something specifically that you're curious about that you want to make sure we touch on during this webinar, that would be super helpful, because there are ways to tailor it to specific questions. So we have some threes, so pensive. I like that. Six, six, four. All right, four is pretty cool. Um, my oldest made it to the top team in Minneapolis for basketball, so I'm really connecting with that. We have some more fours and sixes and threes. All right. Yep. And I would say that I am probably, I would say a three. Um, and we'll talk a little bit about how this kind of works, but I have been dealing with some health issues, which is one of the reasons I moved from doing crisis work into a more administrative position. And so my body has been really sore lately. We have two, say, I like the rock star. Okay, and is there anything specifically that folks want to make sure we touch on or that have questions that I can try to incorporate in throughout this session today? All right. Well, we will jump in. So, if you have been on sessions with me at Atlas before, some of these concepts are going to be familiar. We're really going to think about how we can use these concepts in order to work on change for the whole organization. And the basic concepts of trauma-informed practices and healing-centered care, they don't change that much, but there's a lot of different ways that we can try to understand them and apply them at different levels in order to create change. And all levels of change are incredibly important. So, just to start, because we're really going to focus on the organization today, um, what organizations are. So, organizations are living and complex and adaptive systems, and organizations, like people, can be traumatized, which sounds kind of strange because it's not a human being, but the entire organization, due to a lot of different relational patterns and parallel process that we'll dive into today, the whole culture can change to be a traumatized system and to further cause harm to everybody within that system. So both learners and staff and administrators can all be impacted by this. And this happens, kind of the cause of it is just chronic and toxic stress that folks who work in the helping professions are constantly facing, the exposure to traumatic events through supporting other people, as well as the experience of the staff themselves. And this is what can kind of impact, not kind of, this is what impacts the organizational culture. So it is really important that we address this on an organizational level because otherwise we will just continue to cause harm. We won't actually be helping. We will be adding to the problem of everybody that's interacting within our organization. So to understand this, it's also important to really understand culture and the different levels of culture. So when you're thinking about culture, we need to think about it on these different levels. And so there is the parts that we can see that we can collect. So when you walk in, things that you notice, what's hanging on the walls, how are people talking together, what is the technology like, what is the layout. You could also have like mission and values at my organization. Our mission and values is all over the place. So you could actually go in and see that this is a driving force for the organization. There is also, though, both the written values, but then also how people talk about it, how people experience it, the reasons that they work there or they get served and come to this place, why people choose to be there and not somewhere else. And then under it all, which can kind of be the real motivators that we don't always understand, but is the hidden pieces. So this is unconscious beliefs. These are underlying assumptions, um, things that we aren't necessarily sharing or always aware of. But this can really be that feeling you get when you walk into a space. And all of that makes up the overall organizational culture. So all parts and members, both staff, leadership, and learners alike, all make up the system and contribute to the culture. And so, because of that, the organization's culture can change, and it's always changing because it changes based on who is coming in and what we're bringing in. But it is also, when we're trying to intentionally change it, it is super resistant to change. And that's why it's so challenging. Um, and the other thing that I did mention before is a huge driving force is how the organization views itself. So this is the stories that we tell about how the organization was founded, the shape of the organization, what is the internal landscape, and what's the environment. Uh, I worked in Minneapolis public schools for a while on their culture and equity leadership team. And during that time, we had the first teacher strike, as well as we were operating, as everybody knows, in a huge deficit. So that internal landscape that we are spread too thin, that we don't have enough impacted the culture on the day, on every single day, as well as that external environment. And so this was the year coming out of COVID. Schools were still closing sometimes and then opening back up. And so all of that was really influencing the way that huge, large system and organization was operating. And then on top of that, each building you went into would be different because it would be different people coming into that building. So it's a very dynamic experience. So so as you think about the organization where you work, some of the things to reflect on is what is the origin or creation story, especially in school districts. Sometimes it just isn't even spoken about because they've been around for so long, right? But there might even be a story about how the adult education department within that school district came to be. Otherwise, sometimes there's actually big stories. I worked in a very small district in the Northeast Metro, and there was a lot of conversations about the history because a lot of the people who were alums were now working there. So there was a personal investment into that history. But there was also a complicated history when it came to racial dynamics and the changing in that community. And that really influenced the culture. Another thing is why do we exist? And that really informs us. And that can both be the mission statement, but also what is it? Why do we think this is important? What is our goal or our goal to work in this area, right? What are those deeply held beliefs? I believe that all people should have the opportunity to learn new language, to have career opportunities, to get their GED. Like, what are those things that are fueling it? We also need to think about organizational stories and secrets. There can be harm in the past, especially organizations that have been around for a very long time. There can be wounding in the past, so people can have really a strong reaction. Another district where I worked, there had been cuts a couple years ago. And so, especially as some of the changes at the Department of Education happened, and there was some insecurity around funding for the idea, so the act to support students with disabilities as well as Title I funding, the anxiety went up across the entire district because they'd already been through huge cuts. And then there's often different professional cultures, right? And so if it's largely volunteer supported, if it's mostly folks with an educational background, with a mental health background, all of these things add to what becomes the makeup and the experience of the culture, as well as what's going on around it. So it's always incredibly relevant, but there's so much that's happening, and that seeps in and impacts how organizations function and how it feels to be in them. So as we're looking at and trying to pull apart all of these different aspects, because it's so many different components when we're thinking about organizational culture, we do need to think about power and how power is held and how power is used. And there's different models of types of power. And it oftentimes people aren't just in one. And there's opportunity or times where different types of power are needed in order to function as an organization. And so when you're thinking about the types of power, don't just think about the executive director, CEO, or supervisor, but there's power when you're in your classroom. There is power within social networks within the organization. And so there's a lot of different ways that power comes in. Power from privilege and experiences, right? So really think about all these complicated factors. So one type of power, according to Vanessa Jackson, is power over. And so that is often seen, especially in a hierarchy. But this is like, I have the power, so I have power over you. You must do what I say, right? This is an incredibly familiar form of power. It's a type of power we see all around us. It's definitely a huge part of power in the politics, and especially right now, I would say, but always really. There's power from within. And so this is a personal power. So I have power because I have mastered these things. I'm able to do these things. There's different characteristics within me that give me power, which could also be power, just the self-confidence, the power that self-confidence brings with you. And there's power with. And so that's when groups of people align and come together and create power. So this is a huge part of any type of protest or civil unrest that has caused change. But this also can be, in a more formal way, maybe a committee in an organization that is manifesting influence through their connections and working together to try to create change. So there's many different ways that we can see the power with. Another type way to look at power, and this is one where we often will actually move between. Generally, people have a place where they feel the most comfortable, but you'll often be required to or need to work on different types of power to be more comfortable with them. And so one is positional. This is do what I say because of the role I have. This can also be reward based. So, in the most simple version, a salary, right? We have a reward based system. This can be, this is my title, so listen to me. This is um, my past experience, what's on a resume. But this can also be like, you can also use this in a coercive manner, which is less adaptive and can cause more harm, right? If you don't do what I say, this is going to happen when we're using coercion. Competency power is do what I ask or give me power because I know what I'm doing. I'm smart, I'm an expert, I've read a lot. Um, so that's competency power. And then relational power is do what I want because you like me, right? So it's power through the relationships. So, like for instance, for me, and this was really heavily influenced, I think, even in my career, but my most comfortable area in this is relational power. I like to be liked. I went and became a social worker because of that. I want people to want to do things that I think are a good idea because they like me and they trust me. Um, and so that can be really great. I've developed really good relationships because of that relational piece of it. However, there are times where in specific roles and leadership roles, right, where I have had to not worry so much about that relationship and make decisions for the well-being of the organization, right? And sometimes people don't agree with me, and sometimes it has to become one of those, well, this is my decision and this is why I'm making it, and you need to fall in line. So these are all important pieces, but we do need to be aware of them and aware of how we are using them and wielding them with other people. Another piece to think about is, and just this idea of power, is leadership or management. And I think this idea of leadership and being a leader can be really romanticized and is incredibly important. But you need both leadership and management in order for an organization to function. And so if in a leader role, you have the vision, you're the strategy, the big picture, this is what we're going towards, um, using a lot of abstract concepts, big ideas. Inspiration can really come out of leadership. And then management, which I think sometimes can get discounted a lot of, but is so incredibly important. And those of you who've worked in an organization where there's leadership but no management will really appreciate it, is just like, how are we going to get there? What are the day-to-day activities? It might not be as attractive or exciting, but like, what's the budget? What are the procedures? What do we need to do to be able to get to this big idea? And it's important to think about how is that balance working, right? And if there really is a role or a person that is more in a leader role and somebody who's more in a manager role, how are they working together? Because otherwise it can cause a significant amount of cognitive dissonance within staff. Another thing to think about is if there is a small organization, it might be the same person that's both being a leader and a manager. And how is that balance happening? How are you both creating these dreams and goals for the future? But then also thinking through how are we actually going to get this? What does the day-to-day look like? And so I want you to think about both your organization, and where is the leadership part? Where is the management part? Is there one where it's kind of a strength of the organization or of the person? Is there an area for growth? But then also you and how you go through life. We generally tend to find one a little bit easier than the other. And so we have to be really cognizant and think through how am I balancing that out to move forward. So whether this is within the classroom and within the organization or a team or a committee, how am I balancing these concepts of leadership and management? So we are going to take about 5 minutes and have everybody just do your own journal or reflection and think about your organization and where you're working and what are the values that is shared within the organization. Is there an origin story? What is it? How do you see it play out? Does your organization have an identity that it communicates, or is it a more of a felt sense? And what does that look like? And do people have the responsibility and authority to do their job? So this is another really important aspect is when people have a lot of responsibility but don't have the authority to actually meet that, right? Like they're responsible to make sure this project happens, but they don't have the support in order to ask people to do their parts, then that can often lead to compassion fatigue and burnout. And then what are the patterns of decision making? What kind of power is used? How are decisions made within your organization? So I'm going to just mute myself. I don't have a timer on the screen, but I have 2:55, so we'll come back at 3. And I would love if a couple of people could just share some of the ideas that came up as we were talking during this first part of our session today. I'm wondering if we can just take a minute, if anything came up that somebody might be comfortable sharing when you're thinking about whether it's where you currently are working or past experiences that you have, something that like jumped out or something you've observed. Okay. That doesn't seem like anybody has anything. Um, One thing, place that I really think about a lot is when this was a while ago, I worked at a domestic abuse organization. And this organization came out of the women's movement, out of feminism. And so, really, a core piece of its identity was social justice, but also to do as much as you can with very little resources. And you could see that even when their big grants were received, you looked around and there was this sense of scarcity everywhere that you went. And it wasn't necessarily always reflective of what the financial situation was of the organization. Similarly, I worked at a very small district, and so anytime there was change that would come up, there's this idea, oh, we're too small, we're too small. That could even be kind of self-defeating, and it was because of this idea of identity. We do have some things in the chat that are seeing a lot of mixed power, and I think it can vary throughout the organization. Yeah, that's usually pretty normal, right? And often we'll talk a little bit about parallel process, but if there is a form of power that a leader really is comfortable with, you might see that paralleled throughout the organization. But generally, when it's really higher functioning organizations, you will see examples of all different types of power. Not so much coercive, but there are times where there needs to be a power over or a competency power and having faith in the skill and knowledge and the relationships. You're going to see that and see people move through different ways of using the power. Some of the most harmful things that can happen in an organization is when people are really uncomfortable with the concept of power. And they just try to avoid talking about it. And that generally tends to be people who have more power. And if you're not aware of it, you can do a lot of harm. Um, and then also it is really normal, as Patsy puts an example in there, that things are going to shift too, and teams are going to shift. When new people come in, when people retire or people leave, you're going to see a shift in the team culture, and you're going to see a shift in the identity and the dynamics on the team, and that can be really challenging at times. Um, all right. Oh, I don't know what I did. Sorry.
Today is
I'm having a little technical issue. Sorry about that. And I might be going into the wrong version of the slides, but we'll figure it out as we go. All right. So as I said before, organizations are able to be traumatized just like people are. And part of it is because organizations are made up of people. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we can identify it. This is a quote by Vivian and Horman. They wrote a book on organizational trauma. It's on the last slide. I highly recommend it. A lot of the concepts in this webinar come from that book, and they say it is important to distinguish between suffering as devastating trauma and becoming a traumatized system. Many organizations suffer devastating traumas. The individual and organization both are in pain, suffer loss, grieve, and are vulnerable because of the catastrophe. But they can recover and do not necessarily experience a long-term impact that negatively reorients their worldview. And so if we think about this in comparison to the individual experience of trauma, many people experience traumatic incidents, unfortunately, and not necessarily all the time do they experience long-term effects that go back to that trauma. So it is possible to go through something really hard and to not become traumatized. That happens both on the individual level as well as the organizational level. So when we're working and thinking about the organization, we want to think about ways we can bring up that resiliency within the organization. What are things we can put into place to make the organization more resilient to go when it goes through very difficult things or traumas or losses, that it is able to bounce back and still be a healthy system. So some of the risk factors um, that make it more likely that an organization stays traumatized after a traumatic incident are limiting attitudes and worldviews set at creation. So if there isn't any ability to think kind of outside the box or to think more big picture, that can be really challenging. When there's unproductive relationships between the organization and the environment, that is also a risk factor. And some of that is because just like human beings, when we go through a difficult thing, we rely on other people in our environment to support us and help us get through that. And when you don't have those productive relationships as an organization, it can make it really challenging. Another thing is when there's organizational amnesia. And so this happens when an organization goes through something hard and then um, and then forgets whatever they learned about it. So then they can keep going through the same issue over and over and over again, right? So an example would be if they had mismanaged money, right? And then they had to do tons of cuts that can be hugely traumatic for an organization. But then if they don't learn from that experience and that happens again and again and again, with each time that happens, it increases the risk for long-term um, adverse effects. And the other thing is when there's unrecognized wounding from previous trauma. So when there's this idea that, okay, we're just going to power through and there's no space to or time to reflect, to connect, to make meaning, that increases the likelihood that there's going to be a long-term traumatic impact on the organization. I worked with a teacher of mine was Resma Menachem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands. And we were working together when January 6th happened in 2021. And we met shortly after that. And one thing he really pointed out was there is this value that was placed, and we're just going to power through and we're going to get the business done, which is a good thing. But there was no opportunity for people to sit back and reflect and connect and process what had just happened, which gives no place for all that stress to go to. Which increases the likelihood that there's going to be long-term adverse impacts. So just like with humans, their organizations have different types of traumas. So one type is a single or multiple devastating events. This can happen both externally and internally. So externally, if there is community violence, if there is the assault or harm of a staff member, an active shooter situation, if there's huge funding cuts or shutdowns of programs, that's a devastating event and influenced from the external factors. Internal, when there's a loss of an important leader or when trust is broken, like somebody within the organization steals money or if there is assault or widespread layoffs, that would be an internal single or multiple devastating events. There's also, much like complex trauma for the individual, ongoing wounding. So when an organization is going through hard times over and over and over again, and there's just this constant high stress, that can impact the organizational culture and create a trauma organized system. So an external example of that would be a pattern of inconsistent and unreliable financial support. So rather than just one big funding issue where they cut a bunch of programs, ongoing and constantly at risk of having to shut down or not knowing if the organization's going to last. If the focus of our environment and where people donate money, that kind of changes, right? Things can get sort of trendy. So when things change and priorities change, and the organization's no longer receiving the support it once did, that can happen for a while. Um, Also, attitudes of disrespect or devaluation. This happens a lot in schools and the experience of teachers. And then internally, if there's exploitation of staff or harassment of employees. So these are things that are happening over and over and over again. It's not just one incident, but it is ongoing. Another part, and this is cumulative trauma. And there's two different types of cumulative trauma. And so one is empathic work. And so that is the helping professions. So when we're thinking about compassion fatigue, this is when we are exposed to the traumatic experiences of others, whether it is spoken, witnessed, or just in the presence and helping people who've been through really hard times. Um, After a while, that can really begin to wear on us. Um, and it can start to change our worldview, the organization's worldview, and sense of hope and autonomy and agency can start to change. There can begin to be a feeling of like hopelessness or defeatism, right? Like no matter how hard we work, we're never going to be able to make the changes that we want. In my experience right now, there's that sense in the environment. We're in such kind of an explosive time right now, and a lot of programs are getting cut, and there is a lot of folks I've worked with have the sense of feeling defeated, and feeling disempowered and disconnected. Another part of it is redemptive work. And so this is more focused and wanting to make social change. So, like, this is our value. We want to change society. We want to make sure more adults are able to get better paying jobs, to be lifted out of poverty. And that's why we have these programs and these training programs. But then things keep happening that make it impossible. And that can have a similar where things start to just break down and there's frustration. And no matter how hard we work, this is going to keep happening. With the organization that I had talked about before, the domestic abuse organization, add both of these I was constantly dealing with, right? So, on the one hand, it was predominantly trauma work and healing from traumatic experiences. And so people would get compassion fatigue and just kind of exhausted by the work. But it also had a larger mission and value of trying to end family violence, um, and to adjust, especially gender roles, to have more like equity and power sharing. And so when there would be changes in the political landscape or decisions that were made, um, or like people, while I was working there, the United Way had changed their focus from supporting domestic abuse organizations to, I can't remember, to something else. A bunch of funding was lost. Things like that can add to it because you feel really alone, in trying to fight for that. So, some of the examples that really help to pay attention to when a system is trauma organized is when there's inadequate emotional containment. So it is good to go and ask for support and to talk to your colleagues and to feel connected. That helps with resiliency. But there is a difference between doing that in a productive manner and just dumping all the time and everybody feeling very kind of spinny and out of control. And you might feel good for a moment, and then somebody else comes in and kind of like dumps everything in you on you, and then you're like not feeling good anymore. And there's intense reactivity, right? This is the whole organization is hyper vigilant. You will also see when this is happening, people tend to be incredibly stressed out, and there's higher rates of calling in sick to work. When there's ongoing instability, so the system's destabilized, it could be from factors externally, but as well as internally. And there's questions about whether or not the organization's going to survive. Where I'm working now, we've been having to repair a lot of financial mismanagement that happened in the past. And so this is something we're constantly having to reassure and work on with people. That can be really hard if you don't know that your job or the place where you go to get help is going to be there tomorrow. It leads to a sense where your stress response system can't calm down. Feelings of shame and guilt. People might get a much more defensive because they're feeling blamed and isolated. And that is very deeply connected to a lack of trust in other people. So I don't believe you're making these choices in the best interest of all of us. There can be triggers, right? So that district I talked about that had huge cuts. And then the financial situation was changing. People were getting really triggered because they were worried that there were going to be mass layoffs again. And when there's extreme swings in the pendulum from enthusiasm and relief to discouragement and worry, when it's you have high highs and low lows, that is an example. And when the systems don't feel fair or transparent, trauma lives in secrecy and it is cultivated in secrecy. And so when people don't feel like they can trust or they know what's going on, that is often caused by organizational traumatization. So when you're in these organizations and you're dealing with us, some of the things you can pay attention to is closed boundaries. There's a lot more doors might be shut. Some of it is just trying to like take care of yourself. There is a lot of kind of clickiness. So like in group and out group and really focused on insider relationships and less willing to bring in other people. And in social work, we a lot of our profession is really based on this systems theory. And in systems theory, individuals can be systems, organizations, families. But when a system is unhealthy, it stops taking feedback, right? So it just kind of shuts down because it's in survival mode. People are in fight, flight, freeze, so it can be super reactive. People can also kind of look dazed or shut down, just kind of like doing the motions, but they're not really present. They're in kind of almost a dissociative state while they're at work. And there is just, yeah, a constant lack of trust in the organization. And this experience is an emotional contagion, so this can spread, and we'll talk more about this throughout the organization. So it is almost like a disease or a sickness. And there's a lot of blame, there's a lot of defensiveness, depression, despair, loss of hope. So one of the things that I really notice a lot is those closed boundaries and the kind of clickiness that isn't present when an organization is high functioning, right? When people are feeling good and feeling healthy, they're much more inclusive. And we're not going to focus on this time. We've done previous webinars on traumatic stress and helping professionals, but I do think it's important for us to reground in what compassion fatigue is because that most people, a lot of people in or traumatized organizations are experiencing this. And the first thing, which I can't stress enough, is that you do not suffer from traumatic stress or compassion fatigue if you're indifferent. And so some of this is just inherent for caring about your job and caring about the people you work with. And so it's more of a workplace hazard. It isn't a deficiency in character. Um, and burnout and compassion fatigue is often used really incorrectly, and the different terms get used in the wrong places, and people don't necessarily have a clear idea of what each different experience is. And so this slide is one that I made just to be able to kind of compare and contrast. And so in the model of compassion fatigue that I really operate out of is that compassion fatigue is the umbrella. And under it, there are different types. And two of the types, burnout and moral injury, do not require any sort of trauma exposure. So you can be an accountant and experience this. You can, you don't need to be working in a helping profession and healthcare or with groups of people who've experienced trauma. Burnout is just exhaustion. So sometimes the intervention is actually just workload management. This is when the caseload and workload is too large. People are exhausted. They start to disconnect, so they feel disconnected and they start to almost dehumanize other people because they don't have the emotional energy to be able to fully hold the humanness of other people. It's a result of exhaustion. And so the intervention for this is really to work with a manager, supervisor, might be to take a vacation, is to look at workload and how to better balance it. And that's kind of how you handle burnout. Moral injury, this is the experience when you are witnessing a system or working for a system that is consistently making choices and doing actions that trespass against your deeply held moral beliefs. I think an easy way to think about this is like in the child protection system. There's a lot of people who work in the child protection system that work there because they care about the health and well-being and safety of kids, and they want to keep families together. And then over and over, they see the system as a whole making choices and causing harm that goes against their values and beliefs. This happens in education and criminal justice and healthcare. The list goes on and on. And the core feature of this would be that dissonance or inner conflict. Like, am I bad because I'm working for this or I'm not changing this? There can be a lot of shame and guilt. And so the primary intervention for moral injury is really like remembering and making meaning, like, why am I still here? Does this still matter? And if I am, if this does still matter, and I want to still be here because I want to make the changes, then I need to forgive myself for not making the changes fast enough. The second two are secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. And these two are very different because they do actually require some sort of traumatic exposure, right? Whether it is seeing or witnessing or hearing about, or just being around someone and like bearing witness to the hard things happening over and over and over again. Secondary traumatic stress is more acute. This is more like PTSD for helping professionals. You have the similar symptoms, so the hypervigilance, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, avoiding triggers. And often you do need some sort of mental health intervention like PTSD to be able to heal from this. When I was working as a therapist and doing narrative exposure therapy, which requires really diving into the details of traumatic events. I was processing with a client of mine her first experience of childhood sexual abuse, and I was nightmares. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop tasting what she tasted. I couldn't get it out of my head, and I needed to go seek and get help because I couldn't be a good therapist to her when I was having such a big response to her story. Um, and so I needed to go get myself healthy so that I could support her because it was her story. Vicarious trauma is more of that kind of complex or chronic when you just see over and over bad things happening to good people, and you start to have a change in your worldview, a breakdown of your beliefs. For me, it feels like almost like a storm coming in. Vicarious trauma is something that for me happens just every couple of years, whereas secondary traumatic stress is much more acute. And it's hard to remember when you have vicarious trauma, the resiliency of people, have hope for the future, trust yourself, trust others, any sort of intimacy. And so when you're dealing with vicarious trauma, it's incredibly helpful to have tangible acts of care. This is where the community comes in and meaning making. Why is it that I believe in this work? Why am I doing it? And really focusing on building up that meaning and taking care of yourself and finding that balance. Yes, bad things, hard things happen, but this is still worthwhile. Any questions about that? I feel I can do an entire webinar just on these, and so that was a lot of information dumped, but I think it's really important because the different experiences require different things. And sometimes we just say burnout or compassion fatigue for everything, and then we don't know what we need to do in order to try to heal and to take care of ourselves and to take care of the people around us that are going through hard times. And so when you're in a traumatized organization, you will see most, if not all of these. Secondary traumatic stress is less common, but vicarious trauma, moral injury, burnout, all of that is stuff that's happening within traumatized organizations. So it's something to pay attention both for yourself as well as for those around you that you care about. So while we're having these experiences, one of the things that can happen is that we can have these unconscious patterns in our relationship. And this is one of the reasons and ways that um, traumatization can spread throughout the organization, right? Because trauma influences our relationships, and we have these repeated unconscious patterns, and that becomes like it has a contagion effect. And so adults and kids will often replay these unconscious relational patterns, and they can really be a key force that's influencing the organization. And one of the main ways it can be really hard to stop these patterns is because we're not always aware of what's happening and our role in it. And so one of the ways this happens is because we all have these things called mirror neurons. This is what allows for our capacity to have compassion, to put ourselves in another person's shoe. So even if that person isn't speaking directly about what's going on for them, we can sense it. We can feel that that's that emotional attunement. We can imagine what it would feel like, and we can spread our emotions throughout the organization, even if we think we're leaving whatever we're carrying at the door. Similarly, neuroception, this is another function that's talked about a lot in Stephen Porges talks about this with polyvagal theory. But we are constantly scanning our environment and our inner and our outer worlds to try to understand if we're safe, right? This is how we've survived. And so our brain's automatically doing this, and we can't really control it. And so we're constantly trying to figure out if we're safe or not. And so even if people aren't sharing what's going on, if there's that sense, I don't know if anybody's walked into a room and you're just like, oof, something's going on here. That's coming from neuroception. And people who've been through a lot of traumatic experiences, um, they have even an increase, a more sensitive, their neuroceptions on hyperdrive because they're constantly trying to keep themselves safe because they haven't been safe for a while. And so any little thing, you walk into a classroom, and if you're teaching, and a lot of your, especially if your students, which is generally true for adult education classrooms, have been through a lot, have been hurt a lot. And even if you don't say anything, if you're bringing something in, they'll be able to sense it because their brain is doing it. And I can tell you, kids have incredibly attuned neuroception. And so we're constantly scanning. Similarly, if we come in calm, feeling really safe, people will calm down to meet us. And this is especially true for leaders, for teachers. When we are the person in power in that space, people look to you in order to get their clues. Are they safe, whether they're aware they're doing it or not? So we set the tone. Another key piece of this is the reenactment triangle, which if you have been to any of my sessions, we've talked about this a lot. Um, in the chat, Patsy asked if neuroception looks different for neurodivergent folks. It's something that like everybody has. And of course, it can look different. It looks different for just different people, regardless, right? But there's definitely folks that I've worked with on the autism spectrum, especially folks that maybe if they can't speak or, if they're deaf, they're going to be super sensitive to picking up these cues in other ways. But whether it's ADHD, whether it's autism, trauma, all of that, you're going to see different responses based on the neuroception and what people are picking up. Okay, so Cartman's drama triangle, this is how we reenact traumatic experiences. And even if let's say we don't have one big traumatic experience, when folks are unhealthy, we often go back into these roles. This is kind of by default, and this is something that can impact us personally and in our friendships and romantic relationships and as parents. It can also impact us professionally. And when we are in these roles, we often aren't aware. So this is one of the ways that we need to be really reflective and self-aware. And so you can tell when we have rescuer, victim, and persecutor. So when you are being in a victim role or feeling put in a victim role, there's this feeling of helplessness and disempowerment. I have no control. In a rescuer role, this happens a lot, especially in helping professions, where there's kind of this expectation or this desire to jump in and fix things for people. And then the persecutor role is when you're kind of made to be the aggressor. And sometimes we do this, like we are causing this, we're trying to gain control over our environment. There's a natural switch from victim to persecutor to try to feel more empowered, but we can also be put in this role. So there can be situations where you're trying to be as calm as possible, and the other person is responding, and nothing you say is right. And you're kind of like, what is happening in this communication, in this conversation? When that happens, you are generally on this triangle, and you can also get spun around this triangle multiple times in less than a minute. Um, so it's something to constantly be thinking about. And when we're on this triangle, when we have kind of, when we're able to identify it, what we want to do is we want to move from the reenactment triangle to the healthy triangle. So if you are in a victim role, if you're feeling really disempowered, like you have no choices, you want to move up to the top of the healthy triangle, which is adapt. What is within my locus of control? What can I change? What can I do? And really focus on that. Even if it's as simple as I can choose whether or not I want to be in this room or whether or not I want to walk away, but trying to identify what is it that I can control. And sometimes walking away is the most empowering thing that you can do. If you are in a rescuer role, what you want to do is kind of slow down and back up and move more into support. So I'm not going to fix this for you, but I will be here. I'll sit next to you while you do it yourself, while you make that phone call. I will be a supportive listening ear as you try to think how you want to handle this with your boss or your colleague. So try to move into a supporter. And then if you are in the persecutor role, the best thing you can do is to take distance and to just give space. The more you try to convince someone you're not uh, persecuting them, you're not being aggressive, the more aggressive it comes out. Um, some of you may have heard this if you've come to my sessions before, but the strongest example I have professionally was when I was working in an elementary school and a second grader had shared about this experience of sexual abuse that she had had at home. And then for months afterwards, she was incredibly dysregulated at school. And so I was kind of her main person. I'm who she disclosed to. I would have breakfast with her. I was also who got called every time she was in a disassociative and destructive state. And there was one point where I was called to intervene, and she was obviously not present. She was yelling and screaming and hitting. And I realized that she no longer saw me, she saw her abuser. I was just another adult that she didn't get to choose whether or not I was there. And so it was hard, and I had to take a moment and I had to reflect on it, and I had to talk to the rest of the support team and say, I need to give her space. She needs to be able to choose. Somebody else has to respond for a while. And so I talked to her. I explained that I'm still here. She can come and ask for help whenever she wants, but she doesn't have to have breakfast with me. She doesn't have to interact with me if she doesn't choose to. And it took about like a week or so, but before I knew it, she was showing up at my door again, and it really helped readjust our relationship so that I wasn't um, kind of being forced on her anymore. She felt some empowerment and voice and choice. So the other concept of why all of this keeps spreading, I mean, I think we've really underlined it. It's in this, as we're reenacting, this can spread. This also spreads through our mirror neurons and through our neuroception. But there is this dynamic of parallel process. So when things are happening, even in the environment or world around us, it can be paralleled all the way down the organization. We also, if you have like a student or learner coming in and you're kind of getting whipped around that reenactment triangle, it is incredibly likely that when you sit down with your manager or supervisor, you might have this, bring that same dynamic into that relationship. and it can spread throughout the organization. So we can often see what's going on because these relational patterns get paralleled. But similarly, this is a huge piece even of therapy. When we change the way we react, that experience that can change that cycle and that can parallel out as well. So an example of this is if students feel unsafe, staff might feel unsafe, and the whole organization might feel unsafe, right? Similarly, if learners and students are hyper aroused and staff get hyper aroused and reactive, the organization will be incredibly fragmented or crisis driven, like we're constantly reacting to the next crisis, right? Similarly to depression, a depressed organization can feel incredibly directionalist, and the staff are going to feel very demoralized. And so you can see how these feelings can parallel throughout an organization and can come in from the outside world as well. So I am going to um, play a video. We're going to pause the recording. And this video, a video that was shared with me um, by Dr. Sandra Bloom, who is referenced a lot throughout this. And this is something she shares. It's a great example of parallel process. This is something this man works in kind of like a juvenile hall type like county homeschool kind of environment. And it's a really good example of how it might not even be direct, like you are coming in angry, now I'm angry at you or angry at someone else, but how it can impact the organizational culture. And this happens in organizations that serve adults, serve kids, um, kind of across the spectrum. So hopefully this is helpful. I'm going to press play. All right. Any reactions? Anybody want to say anything about that video? I think I really like it, and I really like to show it because I think it's a really good example of how sometimes we're focused on the wrong thing when we want to make a change, right? So if we don't have the self-awareness to understand what's going on with us as a team and with our organization, we sometimes can kind of project it onto a learner or a client or even another coworker, right? And kind of put all the blame on there rather than doing our own reflection and really getting to the root of it. Does did anything jump out to folks? I know I've been just putting a lot of information out there, and I want to give some space in case people have anything they would like to share. Anything you've noticed where you work? Okay, well, feel free to interrupt me. One thing with all of these unconscious patterns, one of the first steps is that we need to recognize that this happens. We're humans. We've all done it. We all will do it. We will all play a role in it. And so there's no point in kind of blame or shame because it's just part of being human and going through harder seasons in life. Um, the next is when we realize that it's happening is to try to stop. So, like Mr. Kleinman in the video, he was sitting there and he realized all the changes that were happening and just kind of got curious, like, how is this impacting how we're interacting with this family? And so just slowing down and then finding somebody to consult with is so helpful. Because when we're in it, it is so hard to make that, to identify it, right? Like if you are arguing with your partner, it is really hard to be able to identify what the different dynamics are, in any relationship and friendships, what have. So sometimes we need to take a step back. We need to consult. We need to see what am I bringing into this? What is about this is like healthy? What is unhealthy? and then try to name what's going on so that we have a little bit more of an understanding of what we can do to address it. So from the Mr. Kleinman example, that team needed to get together and they needed to talk about some of the things that were happening and process what was going on so they were able to come up with a coherent plan and a way to feel empowered to be able to work more effectively with that child. On the counterbalance to all of this is compassion satisfaction. And this is the feelings of fulfillment when we're doing our work well, when we're seeing change, of contributing to society and to work. This is that positive part. This is the driving force. And you can have both compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction at the same time. It is not an either or situation. We're gonna not do small groups. I planned way too much content, and I don't want to leave you guys with all of the issues without talking about some of the strategies to address it. So I'm just gonna move directly into strategies. I won't spend a long time on the core of healing-centered environments and engagement, except for kind of this slide where you really want to move. This is from Trauma Transformed. They have a lot of great resources. You want to move from a trauma organized environment, which we just talked about a lot, to trauma informed, which means we're taking what we know about trauma and stress. If you watch the video I had recorded before this, you're taking that information and using that to inform your decisions. This is where you stop hurting, stop causing trauma or trauma inducing. And then healing is allowing the space, slowing down, allowing reflection, meaning making. And this is actually when an organization can start reducing the trauma, start healing. And that is the goal. So I am just going to go straight through this part. You all can get the slides to take a look at this. But to really talk about what we can do as leaders. And remember, leaders can be different roles within the environment. And so some of the ways that we can mitigate organizational trauma is to foster a strong core identity. It's very similar to building resiliency in ourselves. When we have a strong sense of identity, of mission, values, purpose, principles, it is a lot easier to kind of get back on track because you have that framework. So when things are going well, it's important to continue working on really fostering and defining and living in that identity. Also, a sense of organizational esteem and self-efficacy. The more productive people feel, the more effective they feel, the easier it is to come back from traumatic incidents. It is also similarly, the more structures and processes, the clearer and more transparent they are, the easier it is to come back because there's policies and procedures in place. And high structure is a key component of healing-centered practices. It allows for a sense of safety, like in containment. We know how to handle hard situations. We have all of this in place. We're going to lean on it to get through it. Similarly, on the warm side, because high warmth is also a core component, is having hopeful and energetic leadership. So when people have a vision, when they have high energy, when they express hopefulness, when they're able to contain and engage with people and hear them out rather than shutting down and distancing themselves. So thinking about how that parallel process works is incredibly helpful, and making sure that there's opportunities to connect. Like most mental health challenges like depression, the best thing when you're feeling depressed is often to get out of bed and take a shower, but it's also the last thing you want to do. When you're dealing with organizational traumatization or an unhealthy organizational culture, most people would just want to shut down and not talk to anybody. They want to isolate. And usually the best antidote is actually to build peer-to-peer connection and agency, right? And to really foster those opportunities to be able to connect and share hopes and inspirations when things are difficult. So some of the things you can do as a leader, but whether it's a formal role or informal role, is identify what's going on and naming it. Ignoring it doesn't help anybody, and it actually can cause more issues. It's important to contain the impact. So, for instance, if there was a big loss or something happened, one of the districts I worked at, we lost a student. And so we made sure to have somebody from our EAP, like a therapist on site, so people could meet and talk to them if they needed to. We did kind of memorial service, so like containing like that, yes, this happened, this is hard. How are we going to contain the impact and offer the support? Is we also need to express optimism and confidence that we can make these changes and creating a framework where people can reflect and analyze and make meaning out of it. So we went through this really hard thing. We went through these layoffs. We lost a client, or a learner. We lost a coworker. And so where does that leave us? What does that mean? How are we going to be able to like move forward, and how is this impacting us? Being able to identify and champion the organizational strengths. So yes, we've been through this hard thing, but we've been through hard times before, and we are grounded in our values, and we are really good at teaching language or employment skills, and we know we can get back there. Modeling kindness, compassion, and healthy boundaries. Avoid super crisis, like reactive responses, and thinking about parallel process. Like, what is the energy you need to bring that can spread around the organization? Ask for outside help as needed. And just remember that we're all people. So staff need what learners need. It isn't any different. So how are we going to handle this in our classrooms is very similar to how we should handle this as an organization. We also want to make sure that there's access to counselors or to other supports that are needed. We want to make sure that there's safety and stability. So, especially if something happened where people got hurt in the organization, or there was, for instance, with what happened at Annunciation. I know a lot of people who've been part of the response there, and it's counselors and therapists coming in to offer support. But there is also there making sure that people know we are doing everything we can to prevent this from happening again. Name the trauma and then normalize the experience. You don't need to normalize the bad thing that happened, but say it's really natural to feel scared. That's expected. And how are we going to integrate this experience in meaningful and affirmative ways? So, is there a memorial? Is there a ritual? How are we communicating? How are we offering space for people to process it, and process it within relationship and within connection? Um, and so with the recognizing, acknowledging the trauma, you really need to name it. You want to create a process in an organization. You also really want to pay attention to patterns. Are we like every February is something hard happening? Is like, what are we going to learn from it? And then how can we operationalize this to prevent organizational amnesia? How can we make sure we're learning from it? Um, and how can we plan for it? So if we know we go through a hard time every winter, what can we put into place leading up? How can we name it? This is always a hard time of year. How, in schools, you're on such a calendar. So in the spring, there's always a lot of changes and people deciding to come back or not coming back, and being able to just name it that this is coming and we'll get through it like we got through it before. And then making sure that staff are all trained, both in trauma and culturally responsive practices, that they have an understanding of the dynamics and the things that are going on. The more we're able to name it and understand it, and the more we're able to feel empowered to respond and be proactive about it. It's important that roles and expectations and communication is very clear. You want to make sure staff feel supported and that they're given what they need, they feel they need to respond. And sometimes this can be complicated because people will say, this is what I need, but it isn't always necessarily what they need, right? But when we can really offer the support and express that people are valued, that goes a really, really long way. And then having supports ongoing, right? And normalizing that you might not feel this way right now, or you might not be struggling right now, but it's okay to ask for help in the future, right? We don't just grieve for a week. So we are out of time. So I'm sorry that I crammed a lot in. But we do have a couple of minutes and I can stay on for a few minutes if folks have questions or there's something they want to share that really jumped out. I'm hoping that you found something helpful or at least gave some perspective and different ways to view situations that we're all dealing with all of the time, really. I will share the slides.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I'm just checking the
Yeah.
chat here. Yeah, for sure. We'll send out a PDF of the slides in the next few days, and the recording will be posted as well on the YouTube channel.
And
So,
there's a
yeah.
really good question in there about toxic positivity. And the balance is the realness, right? Like you want to be genuine. So if something hard happens, you want to acknowledge this happened and it was hard. You don't want to say, "Oh, it's fine." You don't want to sweep it under the rug. You want to be able to like sit in the ick and just be like, "Yes, this was hard." But the hopefulness is to believe that things will get better in the future. And you really have to believe that. Otherwise, if it's not genuine, people can sense that and it isn't helpful at all, right? And so it's not like reading talking points. You want to really believe what you say while also acknowledging what happened and the impact that it has. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
That's a
Any
great
additional
question.
questions in the last little bit here before we lose our time with Lucy?
I'm going to go to the next. These are some books that I highly recommend. You can
Oh, yeah.
see in the front Organizational Trauma and Healing by Vivian and Horman is really helpful. And a lot of this was taken from there.
I am going to shout out as well, if you'll put that back for a moment, Lucy,
Mhm.
because Lucy, we didn't even talk about this, but that cultivating genius that you're showing in the
Yep.
bottom left, that is our pick for the Leadership Book Club this year for anyone in a leadership role or aspiring to be in a leadership role in adult education. And you can learn more on our events calendar or message me and I'll help you out. So that's one that
Yeah.
we are delving into. And I know The Body Keeps the Score in my grandmother's hands are used widely in our trauma study circles. Thanks for lifting
Mhm.
those up as well. The culturally responsive teaching in the brain is used in our anti-racism praxis study circles. So lots of time overlap with other work that we're doing. So that's very affirming. Thank you. Well, I think we'll go ahead and close the recording, Ava.